What happens when your dog does the unthinkable and brings home a wild bear? Not the kind of bear most people would ever want to encounter. Yet, in this strange twist of fate, an unlikely friendship begins to bloom. This is the story of how a dog and a bear become the best of friends. The wind blew through the valleys of Alo, Wyoming, carrying the scent of pine and the first hint of winter. The crisp October air settled over the small house nestled against the mountain's edge. Inside, the sounds of silence were louder than ever. George Whitmore, at 74, sat at his kitchen window, sipping his morning coffee from a faded blue mug, a gift from Martha on their 30th wedding anniversary. He looked out over the mist that clung to the peaks, stretching out into the distance. The landscape was vast and peaceful, but George felt a deep void, the kind that only time could fill, or perhaps never fill at all. His house had grown too quiet since Martha passed away 18 months ago. It felt too big now. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rustled the trees, seemed amplified in the emptiness. He still reached for her in bed some nights, only to feel the cold space beside him where she used to be. He never was one for words, never had the knack for expressing feelings. Martha used to tease him about it, calling him the strong, silent type. But she understood. Now, with her gone, George found himself speaking to his old dog more than ever. Blue, his 13-year-old husky, lay by the back door, his once powerful legs moving slowly with age. He was a steady companion, always present. But even Blue's company didn't fill the emptiness. George was used to the quiet, but it was a quiet that weighed heavily on his heart. Every morning, George would brew his coffee, settle into his chair by the window, and wait for Blue to join him. The routine was comforting, though it didn't erase the pain of loneliness that lingered in the corners of the house. Blue was always there, of course, but the dog was getting old too. His once vibrant fur had thinned, and his steps had become deliberate, careful. He couldn't do what he used to, and neither could George. After coffee, they would take their walk around the property. It was a small half-acre lot, enclosed by a wooden fence that George had built years ago when his son Nathan was just a boy. Now Nathan was far away in Denver, visiting twice a year with his own family. The conversations were polite but strained. Nathan's worried glances at his father's frailty made George uncomfortable, and he understood. He had been the same way with his own father, dutiful but distant. This particular morning, though, felt different. Blue, who had always been steady and calm, was restless. He sniffed the air with unusual intensity, his ears twitching and his paws moving faster than usual. George noticed it too, the subtle shift in the dog's behavior. Blue was always a good listener, but today it seemed like he was searching for something. "What is it, boy?" George asked, but Blue was already moving, leading him toward the back corner of the yard near the fence. The old wooden fence was no longer enough to keep out the wild. A metallic sound reached George's ears, followed by the unmistakable whimper of distress. George's heart skipped a beat as he followed Blue toward the sound. The yard was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves. But then, as they rounded the corner by the fence, George stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw was enough to freeze him in place. A bear, cub no older than 6 months, was stuck in one of the large garbage cans near the back corner. The container had tipped over, and the cub, its fur bristling with panic, was thrashing inside, trying desperately to break free. Its small paws were caught in the can, and it whimpered loudly as it struggled. Blue, seeing the cub's distress, whined and circled around the can, trying to nudge it with his nose. But there was no way the old dog could free the cub by himself. George's instincts kicked in, but they were immediately clouded with doubt. Bears meant danger, especially mother bears, and George had heard enough wildlife safety warnings to know the risks. But there was no sign of an adult bear nearby. Instead, George saw only the fear in the cub's eyes. It was young, small, and helpless. George's heart softened, and against his better judgment, he decided to act. "Easy, Blue," George murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, the dog or the cub, or perhaps both. The bear cub was scared, but it was also lost and in need of help. He kneeled down beside the can, his hands shaking as he carefully assessed the situation. Blue, ever loyal, stayed close, sensing that his presence was needed more than ever. Together, they were about to do something neither of them had ever expected. George approached the garbage can slowly, his mind racing through every wildlife safety tip he'd ever learned. Bear cubs meant their mothers could be close, and a protective mother bear could be deadly. But still, something in George told him he couldn't just leave the cub trapped and frightened. "All right, little one," George whispered, more to himself than to the cub. "Let's see what we can do." With slow, deliberate movements, George lifted the edge of the garbage can, trying to steady it enough for the cub to free itself. He wasn't sure how much help Blue could be, but the dog had been by his side for years, and they knew each other well. As George tilted the can carefully, the cub tumbled out, landing softly in the grass. For a brief moment, there was silence. The cub sat there, disoriented, blinking at the sunlight streaming down on it. It shook its head, ruffling its brown fur, and looked around, still wide-eyed with confusion. George crouched down a few feet away, not wanting to scare it. Blue sat beside him, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes full of curiosity. The cub glanced up at them, its dark eyes calm now, almost as if it was sizing them up. There was no fear, just a quiet recognition. For a few moments, the three of them sat in an unspoken understanding, the bond between them beginning to form in the strangest of ways. Then, without warning, the cub stood up, shook itself, and walked slowly toward the fence as if to leave. But it didn't climb over or squeeze through. Instead, it turned back to look at them one more time before disappearing into the woods. With the rustling of underbrush, George stood in stunned silence, his heart pounding. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered to himself. Blue wagged his tail harder, trotting over to sniff the spot where the cub had been. Something had shifted, and George knew it. The next morning, George was up early again. He brewed his coffee, settled into his chair by the window, and waited for Blue to join him. But this time, something was different. The house felt less empty, less cold. There was a new presence, something unspoken between him and the dog. Blue was already at the door when George looked up. The dog was wagging his tail with excitement, staring intently at the back fence. George couldn't help but follow Blue's gaze. What had caught his attention? The wind chime on the porch was ringing softly. A gentle, deliberate tapping. George felt his heart skip a beat. He got up and moved toward the door, his hand on the knob. And there, on the other side of the screen, stood the bear cub. It was the same cub from the day before, but now it wasn't scared or frantic. It was calm, as though it had come to visit. It looked up at George with those same dark, knowing eyes, and for the first time, George noticed something different in its gaze. It wasn't the wild fear he'd seen before. It was almost as if the cub recognized him, as if it knew they had shared something the day before, a moment of mutual understanding. Blue barked excitedly, his tail wagging furiously. The cub seemed unbothered, almost as if it was used to the dog's exuberant greeting. George stepped outside cautiously. "Well, what do you know?" he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with disbelief. The cub didn't run away. Instead, it stepped forward, and George found himself talking to it, just as he did with Blue. "Guess you've come for another visit, huh?" And so began the strangest morning ritual George had ever experienced. The cub would show up every morning, always tapping the wind chime gently with its paw. George would make his coffee, and together with Blue, they'd sit on the porch, quietly, sharing the morning. The cub wasn't there for food. It never ate anything George offered, but it would settle beside Blue, watching the sunrise and the world waking up around them. It didn't make sense. But in that moment, it didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, George didn't feel alone. He had Blue, and now he had this unexpected companion, a wild bear that had chosen to become part of his strange, quiet family. Every morning, without fail, the cub would return. It became their ritual. George would wake up, make his coffee, and step outside onto the porch to greet the day. Blue would be there, of course, waiting by the door, ready to begin the day with his strange, new friend, the cub whom George had begun to think of as Cubby. Would tap the wind chime gently, its tiny paw reaching up to make the soft melodic sound. It was a sound that had become as familiar as the call of the birds or the rustling of the leaves. The wind chime had become a symbol of the cub's arrival. For George, it was a moment of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He looked forward to the mornings now, to the simple yet profound companionship of the dog and the bear cub. Each morning, as Blue and Cubby sat together on the porch, George would talk to them. He'd tell them about Martha, about the old days, and sometimes about the things that weighed on his heart. They listened silently in a way that made George feel understood. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer empty. In the mornings, there was a sense of life, a sense of family. The cub had found its place, just as Blue had. And George, for the first time in years, felt like he wasn't quite so alone. Word of George's unusual household spread quickly through the small town. At first, people were skeptical, unsure if they'd heard right. A bear? Living with an old man and his husky? It sounded too strange to be true. But as the days passed, more and more neighbors began to talk about it. Some came to see for themselves. When they arrived, they were greeted by the sight of Blue and the bear cub sitting together on the porch, enjoying the morning sun. The scene was peaceful, almost magical. The cub, large and growing stronger each day, had become a part of the rhythm of George's life. And Blue, ever the loyal dog, had taken on the role of protector and friend. Some neighbors were amazed at how gentle the cub was. They marveled at how calm and patient Blue had become in the company of the bear. George was asked countless questions, but he never quite knew how to explain it. He just knew that this strange, quiet companionship had brought him peace. "I never thought I'd see the day," said one of his old neighbors, Sally Morrison. "But I'll be damned, that bear, he's part of the family now." George couldn't help but agree. It was a bond that had formed without words, without explanation. It simply was. Despite the attention, George didn't mind. If anything, it gave him an opportunity to share something important, something that he hadn't realized he needed to say. It wasn't just about having a bear in the yard. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about connection, about choosing family. And this strange family, as unusual as it was, had found each other one evening as George sat quietly on the porch with Blue and the cub. He realized just how much this unexpected family had changed him. Martha had always said that family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, loyalty, and the choice to stay. And here he was, with Blue by his side and the bear cub at his feet, living proof of that truth. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to find healing in the company of a dog and a wild bear. But somehow it had happened. That night, as he sat in his chair by the window, George opened his journal and began to write. It was something he hadn't done in a long time. But now, with the bear and the dog in his life, he had stories to tell. "Maybe Martha was right," he wrote. "Maybe I needed to open my heart more. Maybe family isn't just about who you're born to, but about who you choose to be with. And these two, Blue and Cubby, they're the family I never saw coming." As strange as it was, George had found his family. It wasn't the family he had expected, but it was a family just the same. The bond between Blue, the husky, and Cubby, the wild bear, had brought him more joy and peace than he ever imagined. If this heartwarming story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and comment with your favorite moment from Blue and Cubby's friendship. And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to hit that button so you don't miss out on more incredible stories. Thanks for watching.